Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today on Exegetically Speaking is Dr. Bill Mounce, president of biblicaltraining.org. Dr. Mounce, welcome.
Good to be here.
You've learned Greek. You've become, for many people, kind of the face of what it means to learn biblical Greek. And you've been at translation as well, both on the ESV, but also the NIV.
Yes.
And sometimes translations get it right, and sometimes translations don't. We're going to look at a text today in 2 Timothy chapter 2.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's interesting because I got to meet Mark Lanier, and he was talking about his work on the commandment, don't take the name of the Lord thy God in vain.
Right.
And it reminded me of this passage in 2 Timothy 2. And it's one of my favorite passages because of what it packs together. He's been talking about the success of the false teachers have been having in Ephesus. And it's really easy to get discouraged when this has gone wrong, these people have apostatized, and that kind of thing.
Right.
And so Paul covers that, and then in verse 19, he goes, nevertheless, despite all the apparent success of the false teachers, let's remember what's going on here. And I'm reading here out of the NIV. He says, nevertheless, God's solid foundation stands firm. So God's foundational work in the lives of believers isn't going to be moved. It isn't going to be changed. It is the work of God is solid, is permanent in people's lives. And then Paul adds that there's an inscription. So he's kind of mixing metaphors a little bit. Think of like an inscription on a cornerstone on a building.
Right,
what do you put on that? How do you mark something as that you own it and a mark that will protect it? And that's what sealing does, right? It marks ownership and it protects the contents of it. So there's two statements on this metaphorical foundation. And the first is, the Lord knows those who are His. And this has always been an interesting translation to me. I think all the translations do it, that the word for knows is an aorist. And I argue in the commentary, it should say the Lord knew those who are His. It's a statement of election. Talking
about Israel, the election of Israel?
No, the election of individuals.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the Lord, I know the aorist can be used outside of a time frame, but you kind of start by putting it in a time frame to see if it makes sense. But I couldn't convince the ESV to make this new, and I'm going to work on the NIV still. But it's the Lord knew those who were His. Basically, it means those who are His children are known by their Father. And He's going to protect them. He's going to hold on to them. It's the function of the Holy Spirit in Ephesians. But I really think this is a statement of election. I'd love to say the Lord knew those who were His, and that's the control and the protection that He offers. But the other half of this is interesting, and this is where it gets into translation theory and how smooth of an English do you want your translation to be, or how much kind of word for word do you want it to be, and so the NIV on one side and the ESV on the other. So the NIV's translation is, everyone who confesses the name of the Lord. This is the overlap with Mark's work on the commandment. What does it mean to confess the name of the Lord? What does it mean to not take God's name in vain? It's the same basic idea.
Yeah.
Everyone who confesses, and most translations say confess here, everyone who confesses the name of the Lord, those who claim that Yahweh is their God, that they are under His lordship, that they belong to Him, He is their Father, whatever language you want to use. Everyone who confesses the name of the Lord must turn away from wickedness. And there's two things that I really like in this. First of all, the word confesses is actually the word to name. Yeah. And this is where I would say we got it right on the ESV, and hopefully we can talk about this in the NIV. But I still remember arguing this in the ESV committee, that it's everyone who names the name of the Lord. And one of the problems you have in translations is there's so much stuff you can't bring into English.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
especially puns. Puns are almost impossible to bring into another language. But the word confesses is onomazon, and the name is onoma.
Yeah.
So it's whoever names the name of the Lord. Well,
Yeah.
they mean the same thing, but naming the name of the Lord isn't as clear. It's not as understandable, which is probably why the NIV and the Net Bible and NLT have kind of stayed away from that. But I think you can bring the pun over and convey the meaning that I am naming the name of the Lord. I am naming Yahweh as my God. He is mine. And that means I have to behave a certain way.
Right. Certain
so-
obligations upon those who name him.
It's obligations. It's the commandment.
Exactly.
But the other thing, so anyway, that's naming the name is not quite clear in terms of meaning, so the more dynamic translations will stay away from it. Translations more like the ESV, don't mind if you have to stop and think and maybe look up something to figure it out. Yeah, so I mean, so you have language theory is going on in here.
Well, Mark's point, it seemed to me that naming the name, the word name is not just, as he said, a label.
Right.
It is an understanding of the character and of the history. And Mark uses this phrase, the CV.
Yeah. Yes.
We know Yahweh's CV.
Yeah.
We know what kind of God he is, and we know what he's done in the past. Yeah. And this means I belong to him.
Right.
But it also means, in this particular case, that I'm going to stay the heck away from evil.
Yeah.
Right? Adikias.
Yeah, and Mark's use of the character of God, actually for Torah, I think is the point he was making, that Torah is about the character of God.
Yeah.
Whether it is food laws or some of the other laws in the Mosaic Covenant, that what you're saying is that it's a reflection of the character of God, that God is a holy God, not a profane God. Mm-hmm. And so there's a distinction. And so Israel's supposed to be different from the Canaanites.
Absolutely.
So I thought that, I never heard CV before. But
I had neither. Mark has interesting ways of thinking about stuff.
Yeah.
He's not coming at it as a biblical scholar. He's coming at it as a lawyer and dealing with business people all the time, I'm sure. Yeah.
But the other thing that I think is really important in this passage is Paul is putting together two ideas that most preachers separate, and this is my objection to how people will preach this passage. Wesley and Calvin, this whole divide issue. But what happens is they tend to separate God's elective work in the believer's life and their sanctification. And, so Wesley has this emphasis on holiness, on sanctification, which is good. And Calvin also does, but he also has an emphasis on how you become a Christian, the election.
Right.
But Paul doesn't separate those things. And I wish preachers would hear that. I wish he'd say, in the very same sermon, you can say, the Lord knows who are his. There is the work of the Holy Spirit in their life, confirming the children that they belong in the family, and you can hear the preaching coming up.
Yeah.
And, you can do that. Oh, and by the way, that means as his children, you turn away from wickedness. And my concern at both a theological and a practical level is how preachers will preach one of that, but not the other. In other words, they're stripping the inscription off God's foundational work. And say, well, I like election, so I'll preach election. Well, I like holiness, so I'm going to preach holiness. I said, well, Paul doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Paul preaches both in the same breath.
Yeah.
And this
same sentence.
This is one of the strongest statements, I think, in all of Paul, that those things belong together. And so so there's some translational things in this verse that are fun, but theologically it's a really important point.
Wonderful. Yeah. Bill, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Good to be here.
Thanks to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Krista Sanchez for helping us to produce this podcast. Thanks as well to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, the best place you could do that is Wheaton College. They have an amazing program, one of the best I've ever seen, whether you want to be a graduate or an undergraduate student. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Contact us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.